My earliest memory is when I was not more than 2, because I was sleeping in a crib, and I remember Dad coming up to get me in the early morning and pulled me out from under the covers, and he said, "You've left a rabbit hole." And I looked around, and there was the blankets were humped up in a neat little tunnel, like a rabbit burrow. And I remember that. And he wrapped a blanket around me, carried me downstairs, sat me on top of the warming oven of the old coal stove that we used for cooking at the time.
I can remember that, well, some of the older ones would be gone during the day to school, and I think I would maybe be outside, and I can remember my grandfather, he'd be out working, maybe shucking corn or doing something like that.
My earliest memories are from the house that burned, and I remember the fire truck came out, a pumper, and broke down and couldn't pump water, and there were neighbors and people who showed up. I don't know who all these men were, and they formed a bucket brigade with one person pumping and pumping, and it was doing no good because the fire was raging at that point. Everybody kept trying to put out the fire, and then it was too late to get anything or to get very much in the way of the valuables out. The house was completely destroyed. And then we moved to the other side of the farm, and that's the house that I remember the best. The little knoll where that house stood is still there, empty, or it was a couple of years ago when I came by and checked. I walked up to where the house had stood, but as I stood there, I had just the warmest feeling come over me. At that point, I knew that I had had a very happy childhood.
We always had a lot of people around. People would leave their children at the farm. Uncle George and Aunt Louetta would bring the kids out to play, and when they wanted to go home, they would call the kids, and the kids had disappeared. So they'd have to go away without them, come back 2 days later. We used to have a lot of company on weekends, family. Dad always would invite people, and sometimes my mother would fuss, but she would cook and love to do.
I could always remember that our mother was always cooking something, or baking biscuits or something. And one thing I can remember this big iron kettle that she had, and she'd fill that up with bean soup, and she'd be cooking that all day, and boy, that was really good soup.
Grandpa was, the earliest things I remember about him was when he dressed up. He was a dandy. He would put on his spats, and he never wore a belt in his pants. He always wore braces, suspenders, and he would dress up and do a little soft shoe dance, and I thought it was just great. I think he was much subdued by Grandma's and Dad's old-time religion. I remember when Dad took Grandpa, they were gone several hours. They went to see about getting his Civil War pension. They came back home, and and had discovered that he couldn't get it because he was a deserter. And it was, as I recall, a very surprising thing to all of them, because their feeling was, his feeling was, the fighting was over. Why not go home or go someplace? And Grandpa was 14 years old when the war ended. And that, it's unconscionable for people to put children 12 years old into a bloody war like that. Just totally not to be understood.
I know that a while before he died, he would start jabbering things and talking, and I remember at one time I'd asked my mother, I said, I don't understand what he's saying, or I can't understand him anymore. And I was real little, and she said, well, he's talking in French.
Grandma and Grandpa always lived with us. Grandma was blind. She said her last memory of anything she could see was Annabee's face when she was born. From that time on, she was just totally blind.
Well, one of my earliest memories of Grandma was her as the great protector. Anytime that you did something bad, or you knew you were likely to get into trouble, we'd go running to her. And, well, it's my memory that it mostly was in good fun, because if I could run to her and get to her quickly enough, then she would take her skirts. She always wore these big billowy skirts with petticoats, and she would grab them and wrap them around you to protect you. And as I recall, then everybody would laugh and tell you, well, you better not do that again, because we're going to get you before you can get to your grandma.
She was a very independent, very intelligent woman. She was for women's voting rights, was very positive, and to the time she died would go to the polls on election day to cast her vote. The fact that it was exactly like Dad's vote, or I guess it was, didn't matter. It had to be her vote.
She was our great protector, I guess.